So thanks so much, everyone, for joining in on time. I think the rest will join us as we continue. Once again, I'd love to welcome you to today's session. It's a great pleasure to have us today, and I really appreciate that we made time to join in today. And it's also a good forum where we'll get to also hear about, AMR from a food safety perspective, and hearing a lot of what has been done, and also from the side of Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. So thanks so much, Dr. Jorge, for joining us. I'm sorry I'm not able to share my video because of the network challenge, but that's me in that profile. Yeah, so I'll just start a bit by just introducing you, then I think we can kick off. So our guest today is Dr. Jorge Pinto Ferreira, and he's a doctor of veterinary medicine, and who was originally from Portugal with 5 years of clinical experience, a master's in food safety, and a PhD in population medicine. So his doctoral studies were conducted in partnership with the College of Veterinary Medicine of Northern Carolina and Medical School of Duke University, and were dedicated to the epidemiological aspects of transmission of methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. In 2017, he also got a diploma from the European College of Veterinary Public Health. And between 2012 to 2017, he worked as a consultant in Switzerland. And from October until 2017 to June 2021, he worked with the World Organization of Animal Health, now called WOA, formerly OIE, as the deputy head of antimicrobial resistance and veterinary products department. And in July 2021, he joined FAO as the food safety officer. So thanks so much, Dr. Jorge, for joining us today. And we are happy and glad to be with you today. Thanks so much, and over to you.
Thank you, Danielle. And just to make sure that you see the screens right, just with the two screens. Are you seeing you can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
And see me?
And see you, yeah.
The screen that you see, is it the right one, or do I need to swap them? Do you see which screen? Are you seeing the screen properly?
Yes. So, however, we see two screens. I think there's a slide. Maybe there's one that has some questions.
Maybe this. What about like this? Is it better?
Yes, right now it's better. Yeah.
Yeah. Let me see if I move. All right. Good. Okay. Is it working well?
Yes, it's working well.
Okay, perfect. So thank you, Danielle, and thank you for the invitation to present to you. I think you all have a very cool name. AMR Ambassadors Program for Young People in Africa is very, very interesting name. So thank you for the invitation, and it's my pleasure to speak with you about that. I'm a food safety officer here at the headquarters of the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations in Roma, and I work as a food safety officer, even if and as I started my career as a veterinarian. And I will speak about that. AMR, usually antimicrobial resistance, is abbreviated by AMR, and from the food's perspective, which is also not very common. So let's get going. Daniel already kindly introduced me, so it's and I think I'm guessing that some of you might be veterinarians, doctors, or pharmacists, etc. But the main point that I always like to present this slide is that my original interest in terms of antibiotics and AMR, it was from a clinical perspective. I worked 5 years as a clinician, a dairy cows clinician. And basically, I got frustrated of treating animals that would not recover and would keep being sick. And that was my main motivation to start working on this field and start understanding it better. But I still think about, mostly, I think deep down, I still think about it as a clinician. And then the other aspects come later. So we'll speak about all the other aspects later. The other day, a couple of your colleagues also asked me to do a presentation, and I thought about it. How many disciplines, if AMR did have an account on Instagram, how many disciplines would AMR follow on Instagram? Which is basically saying how many disciplines. We all speak often that AMR is an interdisciplinary topic, but how many disciplines does it actually relate to? And you can see that the long list that I put there. Basically, the summary is very simple. Like, it's a very interesting topic to develop a career. And you see there, starting with the veterinary medicine. I'm biased. I'm a veterinarian. I like to be a veterinarian, so I start with that. But some things are more obvious, like medicine or nursing or clinical aspects are more. Microbiology, for example, is easier. But in reality, there's much, much more into the story. Food safety is one of them. Behavioral change is a big deal. Social sciences are becoming now very relevant when it comes to understanding more of AMR. Even history, looking back, it's very useful. Journalism, marketing, cartooning, policy making, of course. So all these different sciences, disciplines are related with AMR, even if, as I said, initially, I thought about it as a clinical problem. Either doctors or veterinarians wanted to treat human beings or animals, and they couldn't do it. But in reality, we see, and this is to say, developing a career on AMR, I find it very interesting, even if, as I said, I'm biased. But you can see that it's not just the entry point, is not just the medical schools or the veterinary medical schools. When it comes to, of all the topics that we can work on or pay our attention to, usually it's a how can I say, sometimes it's controversial, because when you have different topics, the ranking of importance often is done by the number of human deaths that it causes, and which is sad, it's controversial, but at the end, to be honest, this is how we measure, all of us measure if something is deeply relevant or not at the global, from a global health perspective. And there's this very, very good paper published on Lancet a few months ago that for the first time looked at about how many people actually died directly by AMR causes, or even if it's indirectly associated with AMR, how many people actually died of AMR. And you see that if you had the chance to read it, it's in the average of millions. Then you can count it in different ways, and you'll see, if you had the chance to read this paper, you can start with about 1.2 million. Then if it's the whole overall, even if it's not directly caused by AMR, indirectly associated, it could be close to 5 million, etc. The point here is, okay, we get the message. It's a problem, a global health problem that affects a huge number of people, leading even to death of a huge amount of people. The tricky part here is that if I say 1 million, 2 million, 3 million, 5 million, probably all of you wouldn't really relate to, because at some point we become indifferent. If it's 3 or 5 million, it doesn't affect us until it affects someone that we love. And then that person makes the difference. And that's what we always, when these numbers, that's what we need to relate. If out of the 1 million, 2 million, 3 million, or 5 million, one is the one that we love, then it matters. So that's what we need to keep in mind, that it is a big number. And if it's affect to us, if it comes on to our family or friends, then, or animals, plants, whatever you love, then it becomes really important. As I said, I'll speak in a couple of different things on the connection with food safety, food security, etc. And if we're in a meeting room and I asked you, does food mean to you? Probably we all have a different relationship with food, and food is a very interesting piece. Beyond water, air, food is the thing that we all need to survive. We are consumers. That's something that puts us all together, even if our needs or tastes, desires are very different in terms of food, but we all eat food. And usually food comes with a sense of pleasure. It can be a sensorial pleasure, or it can be, for example, social pleasure. You meet with the people that you like to eat. So food has this good connotation, a very concrete thing, right? We know that we eat and we are satisfied, etc., etc., etc. On the other hand, AMR, it's a much more sophisticated, much more abstract, if you want to say, concept. One is very concrete, and the other one is we have all this microbiological, genetic knowledge, but we don't put the two things together. And by the end of this talk, what I would like you to see, if I asked you, does food mean AMR to you? I hope you all probably you will say no. It means the good part of food. And I hope that by the end of the talk, you still keep the same dissociation. Now, from the technical perspective, we know that some of the AMR is foodborne. And with this said, we just need to keep exploring this path. And one of the things that we have been trying to put together, we are starting to do it, is the quantification. We need to be able to quantify the significance of this. How much of the AMR that we see in different settings comes from food, is foodborne AMR. And that's what we will be keep working in the next years. I think at some point in your education, in different webinars, so you have heard this concept of the One Health. And usually, as again, initially we think about One Health, and very clearly now we know that well, now we have solid references that make this association between use and resistance. It's not as straightforward as this, but keeping it simple, more use means more resistance. So the decreasing use means decreasing resistance. It's not as straightforward as this, but overall, this is a key message. And we also know now that there are three sectors using it: humans, animals, and plants. And probably plants is plants, crops, whatever, horticulture, plant production and protection, etc., is the thing that probably you are less familiar with, like we all are. And the key message here is that it's pointless to point the fingers. And for too long, veterinarians like me, colleagues from human medicine and so on, we kept pointing fingers, saying, well, it's all the fault of the human doctors that do this and that. And the doctors would say, well, veterinarians use more antibiotics, etc., etc., etc. And overall, it's very easy. The conclusion is very old. It's pointless to point fingers and to blame each other. So let's try to avoid that. And now that we know more about the plant sector, let's not use that as a new escape and say, well, it's all about the plant colleagues. It's just we know by default that the three sectors use antibiotics, or if you want to say in a broader sense, antimicrobials, and this has a reflex on the environment. And so this is what we are working on now. With this, the point here is having this technical framework and knowledge is really helpful. I just wanted to put here a side note on this message. How do we transmit this message? And we are speaking about public health, global health, and AMR, and the significance of AMR as a global health problem. And then I put food with a capital S, because AMR is related with food safety and food security. And I think these two concepts should be familiar with both for all of you. And I put there the connection again with food via obesity. And my daughter, I have a now 17 years old daughter, and now she's healthy. But at 6, she was diagnosed with childhood obesity. So at that time, I got more interested in understanding obesity. From how did she think about obesity? And one of the problems of the people that struggle with obesity is that they are convinced that they will be always obese. They really this gets into their mindset that no matter what they do, they will always be obese. And so on AMR, we need to be careful with finding the right balance between this. Okay, the numbers, if you look for AMR, and this is not a joke, even in the spatial stations, the NASA spatial stations, you found AMR. So we need to be careful between finding the balance of, okay, being aware and having a realistic vision of the issues that we now face that indeed are significant. The number of deaths is significant, and the prevalence of AMR is significant. But at the same time, we can't always spread this apocalyptical message saying we are all going to die of AMR and AMR is everywhere. So, because the danger of this, the risk is to think like this: if it's already so bad, why not keep doing the stuff that we have been doing it? And in clinical terms, for example, a clinician, either a human clinician or a veterinarian, for example, if they get into this apocalyptical view, they will think, well, why would I use a more basic antibiotic or older antibiotic and not just use the last generation cephalosporin? Because again, if this message gets into your mind and say, it's already terrible, no matter what I do, it will always be terrible, then why should I change? And again, I mentioned behavioral change. So it is important to find the right balance. In this sense, the situation on AMR is not good at the global level, but there are some positive news. There are several reports mentioning that the antimicrobial use at the national level, in regions, in countries, is decreasing. And so the changes do make a positive impact. And that's the overall message that we need to spread. Then I work for the United Nations. I have the pleasure and the privilege of working for the United Nations. And in terms of antimicrobials, you might have heard about these Sustainable Development Goals, which cover a broad range of topics. And once I stopped and I looked at how many of them are related with antimicrobial use or the availability and the efficacy of antimicrobials, and the list is there. I put several of them listed there. If you, it's actually something that I don't think is natural. Again, when you think about antibiotics, you think about health, and I think, and a lay person will think disease and health. And in reality, the fact that we have antibiotics using, or antimicrobials, if you want, has a much broader benefit or consequences than one we would initially think about. To have this in mind, that the impact at the global level is quite significant. Then I will, since we are speaking about food today, a couple of notes on this. So we use, now we know better that we use plants, antibiotics and antimicrobials, and then it gets complicated. Fungicides, for example, it gets complicated. But we use antibiotics in plants and plants and crops. And this might be news for you, something that you didn't know. And again, like it's important to have several key messages here. Okay, we know that they use. If you stop and think, it makes actually perfect sense. Plants do get sick, and guess what? Even if the pathogens are not necessarily the same as we see in humans or animals, the plants do need to get treated. And so it makes sense when you stop and think about it that antibiotics are used in plants. Now the message is, please keep enjoying your fruits and vegetables if you like. Just have this in mind. It doesn't mean, the message is not never touch again fruit or vegetable because they are full of antibiotics. That's not the message. It's just, it's important to be aware. And then our next step will probably be, needs to be, again, the quantification. Okay, if we use antibiotics, and again, the scope is broader, how much antibiotics are we using in plants? And should we be tackled in terms of priority? I'm guessing, this is a guess, that it's relatively small, the amount, especially in relative terms, but it is something there that we need to be mindful of. A message on this: all antibiotics are antimicrobials, but not all antimicrobials are antibiotics. And this means that there are several other products that we use to, keeping it simple, treat or control microorganisms, and they are not necessarily antibiotic, but they kill. For example, heavy metals, the use of copper, for example. As I was a dairy cows clinician, they have claws problems, and it's very common to do footbath with heavy metals that the animals walk by to treat claw problems, and they work quite well if used the proper way. But this is a concept to have in mind. And I'm not a microbiologist, but we do understand that these mechanisms of cross-resistance or co-resistance, that meaning that the use of vitamin A, if you keep it simple, the message is the use of heavy metals can also mean, in the long term, resistance to antibiotics. So that's something to have in mind. And now, since I think you are aware that the use of antibiotics in animals for growth promotion, meaning that in that case they are not used to treat or prevent or control diseases, but strictly to make animals grow faster, is a very controversial. It's, as much as possible, we are making a lot of efforts that countries stop using them, because from a global health perspective, doesn't seem the best way to go. And now there's this new research saying that there's other products that we can replace, more natural products that could be used in broilers, for example, to make them like the equivalent of the effect that producers are looking for as growth promotions, but in this case, more natural products. So it's again, some good news on research. And for example, keep in mind something. The hand sanitizers that we all used to as a way, as a hurdle to control the still current pandemics on COVID is still an antimicrobial. And again, let's not create any controversy here. It's a necessary thing to break the cycle of transmission. So this is in this, especially in these very unique circumstances, a needed thing to do. We just need to be aware that they are antimicrobials as well. And it's not neutral. It comes with a cost. The fact that we had to use, probably it comes with a cost that we had to use antimicrobials to clean our hands. And again, this was a needed and important thing to break the cycle of transmission of the virus. In terms of terminology, there's in food, there's something, if you, the R, we use all the time AMR, antimicrobial resistance. And in many countries that I have the privilege to visit and speak with the colleagues, the R often gets confused with residues. And a lot of the terminology on AMR is confusing. And this is one, it took me some time to understand. This was the struggle. The colleagues in the countries were in a meeting, were confusing antimicrobial residues, which happen when the withdrawal period is not respected, for example, and a product goes into the human consumption, with resistance. Very different concepts, but important to clarify, and use webinars like this to clarify this. For example, another thing that is very common is to think that the issue of antimicrobial resistance happens in microorganisms, bacteria, if you want to use antibiotics. And many times there's the confusion between the body and the bacteria. And who gets resistance? The body does not get resistance. It's the bacteria that get resistant. And sometimes this concept that seemed relatively simple do get misinterpreted in colleagues that are not so familiar with the topic. On food, for example, a topic on mycotoxins. So when we think about mycotoxins, they are produced by fungi. And it has to do with residues and mycotoxins on this sense. We knew of the existence of mycotoxins and the issues that could bring to the health of animals. But one thing that I put there, the papers, if you're interested in exploring, some of them are quite recent, is the idea is that mycotoxins might seem to have an impact on let's keep it, the withdrawal period of antibiotics in animals, in this case, pigs. In this sense, we administer an antibiotic to a pig, and if that pig had eaten something that had mycotoxins, the expected time that you'd expect the pig to be able to be used for human consumption, the presence of mycotoxins might extend this time for the presence of antibiotics. And therefore, it's something new that we have to have in mind. And again, there's a lot of new. So we have to now handle this knowledge that we gain from research. Another interesting thing is this: on if you speak on dairy, on the milk production, this is often the case. If we treat the cow, an adult cow, with an antibiotic, it's very common that the farmers know that milk with residues of antibiotics cannot be used for human consumption, and they get severely penalized, and the samples are frequently controlled, etc., etc. So that's very clear, and they all know that they should not do that. So that's very clear. What now we know, and initially I thought this was like scientific fiction, is that so producers do not put it for human consumption, but they use that milk to feed the calves, the babies that are going to, and to save some money. But it's mostly like, well, that milk is there. They don't want to dump it in the environment, so they feed it to the calves that are the newborns. And now we know that, of course, this will lead to environmental contamination. It comes out of the feces if there's residues or resistance bacteria. And even more interesting, the resistance bacteria can cause pneumonia in the calves, or much later, mastitis due to resistant microorganisms that the calves ingested when they were babies. So it's from a technical point of view, from the scientific point of view, it's really interesting. I really thought this was scientific fiction. Now we know better. So the message is, okay, so that milk should not be used for human consumption, neither as animal feed, but it's easy to say. And one of the uses that I know is to use that milk to make biogas for heating, for example. But it's still a new thing, and we are trying to, all of us are trying to understand. So what to do with that milk if it's not for human consumption, neither for animal consumption. So in terms of food, don't forget that the definition of food is, for example, food security is that all people at all times have physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food. And so the message here is, if something is not safe, is not food. And so food that has either residues of antibiotics or an antimicrobial resistance bacteria or other microorganisms is not safe, and therefore is not food. And therefore we start spreading this message about food safety and AMR. Sometimes you get questions or skepticism. Do people really get AMR foodborne infections? And the answer is yes. So you have there the answers, some of the papers that you can use if you ever are challenged with that question. Do people really get AMR foodborne infections? And then what you have, again, the message is this: not all AMR infections are foodborne. For example, it can be nosocomial. You go to the hospital and you get the AMR infection there. Not all foodborne infections are AMR, meaning sometimes you might be get an infection, diarrhea, for example, problem, a health problem from a bacteria that is susceptible to the treatment. So it's not an AMR problem. And the question is that we don't know yet how much of the AMR comes from food. And this is something that we'll for sure keep working in the next few years yet at FAO. The attribution, as you can see here, it is quite complex, and you have all this sophisticated modeling and source attribution work that many colleagues around the world are doing. And I think this is very interesting. For example, and again, I thought this was scientific fiction, but now via modeling, I find it fascinating that it seems we are closer and closer and closer to the reality that one of us can go to the hospital, be diagnosed with an AMR infection, and at least have a sense of probability in what was the source of that infection, in the sense of maybe you got this AMR pathogen or even the gene via exposure to a food production animal, for example. And I think this, if you think from the countries and the risk management of the countries, this will be very useful for them. So if you start knowing at the national level, most of the AMR infections are coming from this source, this helps a lot to make sure that the risk management measures are taking at the appropriate sectors. So this is, I think it will be very useful for countries once this gets more and more used. This is a slide from a colleague of mine that is also, I always find it interesting, that the connection between food and sexual relationships, and the message is that when we eat food, we also bring a piece of that we collect from the outside. It's not, doesn't belong to our body, in close intimate to our body. And so if there's a risk associated with this, and if you should be aware of that, and as much as possible prevent it. So what is the environment? I just said we bring something from the outside. And I always find this paper funny because colleagues in Libya a few years ago, so now 13 years, looked for resistance bacteria on rented DVDs. I think you are young ambassadors. So I don't know if all of you remember or even know what a rental DVD is. Now we use Netflix or Amazon Prime or other programs. But there was a time that you used to go to a store and get a DVD, a rental DVD that you bring home and then watch the movie that you were interested at home. And these colleagues at that time looked for resistance bacteria in rented DVDs, and above 10% of them had resistance bacteria, which is like I don't think any of us thinks about DVDs as a source of AMR, but this colleague's work was quite interesting to find it. When it comes to this is a work on plants, we can skip it. For example, if I say water, then I do think that most of us think about the environment. And usually on AMR, the scenario most of the times that we have been facing is that if you look for AMR somewhere, you'll find it. This is what you see. And so you have different colleagues around the world that has been doing, for example, in recreational waters, in sewage waters, swimming pools waters, and I'll say many times, often, you can find resistance bacteria in those different sources of water. And the main thing that we don't know yet is this. I think the next slide is also this. So let's imagine that even in a swimming pool, sometimes you have this really interesting research that you go to a swimming pool and you swallow water, right? And then there is a risk associated with this, even if that water has a resistance bacteria on it, for example. And what we don't know, I think the next slide is on this, is, okay, so if I swallow today water with a resistance bacteria, then this comes in close contact with my body. But what this means, we don't know yet. We are measuring risk exposure. So we know that comes in contact to our body. But if this means something else, we don't know yet. And on AMR, again, I think some of you at least have some clinical perspective or experience. And if you think about diseases, we normally think about the incubation period. So, and we know it can be from hours to days, even years, for example, on tuberculosis in cows. But the AMR is from a technical point of view, is very interesting because we might have an AMR gene in our genome, and if we don't get sick and we don't need to be treated by that antibiotic, then we don't express it. And so the incubation period can be all our lives. We might be spreading it, but we don't express that resistance because we don't need to be treated. And this is in the case of human health. So the point of here is, if you drink water and you do get that gene or that bacteria and so on, what is the risk of that is something that we don't know. And I think it will be interesting in the future to understand it better. As I said, this is a complex problem. I think I've been trying to explain to my parents what I do for 15 years, and I don't think I've been successful. Usually it only lasts 1 month. And then they come back to me asking what exactly do I do? Because AMR is a complex problem. Usually it gets translated as simple as resistance to antibiotics, but all of these things, for example, as I just said, the persistence and so on, it's a complex problem that from the research point of view is super interesting. For example, this idea of fitness cost. There's some papers we used, and I guess this is still the overall way of thinking, that we speak about fitness cost in the sense that the bacteria, we tend to humanize bacteria, if I say this, but I think that it illustrates well the concept. Bacteria get bacteria genes if they're exposed to an antibiotic. So we tend to think, if I remove the antibiotic from the environment, then the fitness cost of having that gene, that unnecessary gene, if the antibiotic is not there, then is too high, and the bacteria would, through the generations and the replication, lose that gene. Now we know better that once resistant, always resistant. And so it doesn't, again, we need to be careful. These generalizations are important to get the concept. And then we need to be clear that it doesn't always happen this way. And that's why AMR is a complex topic, because it's always dangerous to make generalizations. Usually it's not accurate to say this applies to all the antibiotics, to all bacteria in all the animal species, for example. Very rarely this is always true. There's some key ideas. For example, if you reduce the use, you tend to reduce resistance. But sometimes it's hard, for example, to get solid data that illustrate this concept, that in general it is true, and we get evidence of that. And this is the message. Use drives resistance emergency. So the overall message is always reduce the use, or even now the terminology is more reduce the need to use, reduce the need to use. And when we think about this, the message is, for example, reducing the use is a thing. So a farmer, for example, is using antibiotics and stop using antibiotics. So that's reduce the use. The message is reduce the need is, for example, then instead of focusing on the use, you increase biosecurity measures, for example, hygiene, for example, vaccination programs. And then if you implement these things, then you reduce the need to use. And it's a bit of a tricky game of words, but you get the message. It's not until now, until recently, we spoke a lot about reducing the use, and now we tend to spread the message, reduce the need to use. And because if you then ultimately reduce the use, then you reduce resistance. One thing in terms of human behavior is this: awareness is not enough. It's a starting point, but we know in terms of different human aspects. For example, we know that we should not eat so much sugar. We know that we should do more physical exercise. We know that we should save more for retirements. And we know that smoking is not ideal, or drinking alcohol, too much alcohol is not ideal. Still, there's endless campaigns raising awareness to these things, but they don't mean that we as human beings immediately do them. So we need to move on into more actions and implement activities. And as well, tools are also available. So the good news is that awareness is already there. We are at the global level. And again, having the privilege of going to many different countries, I think in general, the awareness is there that antibiotics are important, that the AMR problem is a big deal. And we have also multiple tools. Now it's more a matter of implementing and changing habits. That is not the easiest thing to do. So we have a new project, and that's what I would like to speak with you about implementation of different things. So when you call it act in the sense of the act, do act to save antibiotics, to keep antibiotics working. The act actually comes from Antimicrobial Codex texts, and the slogan is act now to stop foodborne AMR. And this is, I don't know if you have been involved in this, maybe you have heard about this. We work very closely. So I'm a food safety officer, and we work very closely with the Codex Alimentarius. And the Codex Alimentarius basically makes standards or guidelines or texts related with different topics, a huge variety of topics, including antimicrobial resistance. And so this project that we are now implementing with Codex is being implemented in 2 regions, Asia and South America. At the moment, not in Africa, maybe in the next cycle of the project. So at the moment in Cambodia, Mongolia, Pakistan, and Nepal in Asia, and Bolivia and Colombia in South America. This is a project that started last year with an overall budget of $10 million, and the donor is Republic of Korea. And the goal is this: to implement Codex standards. Codex are like guidelines, texts, recommendations, etc., on AMR. And so that's what we have been doing. Again, without entering too major details here in this meeting, there's 2 main documents that we are working on. One is called Code of Practice, and the other one, Guidelines on Integrated Surveillance. The integrated surveillance, and again, I don't know how much of the background knowledge you already have. The ideal scenario is that we can relate use and resistance. And this is easy to say, very, very hard to do. But that's the goal, that we do integrated surveillance. And what we are doing now that the Codex has these 2 texts, the Code of Practice and the Guidelines of Integrated Surveillance, we're implementing these texts into 6 countries, and to help the countries to improve their food safety and increase trade between countries. So this is a meeting that we had in Cambodia, a part of this project, and it's always very interesting to go to countries and listen to the national stakeholders. So this is to start heading to the conclusion of the webinar. Then we can open up for some discussions, and I'd like to hear from you. Again, the message that food and AMR are interrelated. And then the climate change, and I know that the young population is very much linked to all the issues around climate change, does have a major impact as well in terms of which lands can we use, and for example, vectors for the transmission of different diseases. These are shifting. And to be honest, I don't know if we at the moment we fully understand the picture. But it's again, I do think it's a privilege to work here, because it's fascinating to work from the technical side on these levels and putting these topics together. You have my presentation, so you can, then this slide has a lot of information, but you can later look into it and get a better understanding of the connections between climate crisis, food safety, and AMR. The next slide is a video, so I don't know if you'll be able to see it. Let me try it. If not, the message is here. But I'll play it, and then let's see if you can see it. Can you hear it?
We can't hear it, so we can see it.
All right, so that was the video. At least if you couldn't listen to the music, you could read it, and it's about the interconnection of climate change, climate crisis, and food security, food safety, and AMR. So let's see if we can now move. I think it's just, there you are. You can see it, yes. So the last two slides, and then we can open up for discussion. I think the main message here is, okay, AMR is a big deal. That has all these multiple connections, and there's some things that depend on us, like the United Nations and all the Codex Alimentarius, all this, the World Health Organization, etc., etc., etc. All this global work that we do, but don't neglect or don't think that you can also have an impact. And for example, one thing that I always say, we all are consumers, and we can sometimes make a choice of the food that we buy and how we prepare it, how we eat it, and which producers do we benefit from. So that can have an impact, and that is sometimes up to us, depends on our decisions and choices. So don't forget that we all have a responsibility to keep antimicrobials working, antibiotics working, both from the global until the individual perspective. So I'll stop here. Thank you for your attention, and happy to take some questions now until for the next 15 minutes if you want. Thank you. Stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jorge, for that really interesting presentation. I loved because it was really tweaking our minds and making us to really think beyond how we we address things, and getting to see things also from a different perspective. So guys, if we have any question, as we usually do, you can just raise your hand or share in the chat box. We'll start with Emmanuel Nijigena. You can go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for this presentation. Yeah, I would like to ask, as a food consumer, yeah, what can I do in regards to food to combat AMR, yeah, microbial resistance? Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. I could not hear you very well, but I think the question was, as a consumer, what can you do to control, to help to fight this fight against AMR? And it's a very interesting question. And of this, the codex texts that I just mentioned, there's so one of them is the code of practice, and this code of practice already existed, and now it was revised, reviewed, to make sure that it would include the whole spectrum from the food producer to the consumer. So it's an interesting perspective. It broadened up the chain, and again to highlight that it's not about just the producers doing this or that, or governments doing this or that, but the producers also, the consumers in our kitchens, or whatever you prepare food, you have also responsibility. And the easiest message is make sure that you cook or wash your food thoroughly, and that is the easiest thing to do. Again, washing, like there's really interesting research, for example, looking at sewage waters and the use in horticulture fields. And again, there is, I used to think this was scientific fiction, and also emphasize, I don't want you at all to leave the webinar fully worried, oh my God, like I will never touch a salad anymore and not touch a vegetable anymore. And now food means AMR. That's the opposite, and that's not what we want. It's again, just to make sure, okay, food can be a source of antimicrobial resistance, and therefore, as a consumer, I'm better off if I wash my vegetables whenever possible, if I wash my fruit whenever possible, and I cook my meat, for example, thoroughly, to make sure that you probably will not eliminate residues. Hopefully they're not there. But if there's a bacteria that is there, for example, then you would kill that bacteria. The other source of attitudes that you can have as a consumer is, from where do you buy your food? And this is not the easiest thing, for example, because it's sometimes as a consumer, either we don't have the whole information, or let's face it, the reality, like we don't have time when we go to a store or a supermarket to read every label and to make sure that we buy from this or that producer. But whenever possible, and you have the chance, and you know that these producers, for example, and again, this is not easy to do on a real life, but you know that this or that producer tends to make a responsible use, or only when needed, use of antibiotics, then if possible, you should give preference to these producers.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much for that elaborate response, Dr. Jorge. Over to Mwitupa.
Good evening, Dr. Ferreira. And thank you so much for the presentation. Can you hear me audibly?
More or less, yes. Thank you.
Okay. Can you hear me audibly? Could you confirm?
Now very much better. Yes.
Oh, great.
Now very
Okay,
well.
great.
Yes.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for the presentation.
Mm-hmm.
My question was, do you see sort of a gap between how policy affects larger producers, like maybe corporate producers of food, and then your small scale farmers? Do you think that there's enough research on that? And do you think that it sort of disadvantages them, or maybe even advantages them based on the research? Thank you.
Well, yes. I mean, it's obviously a good point. Like, it's a good point on policy making. And for example, I was very involved throughout the years. In Codex Alimentarius, we have these different the two texts, or three texts that we developed. And the codex time frames. It's a very interesting, because you can take years to write a 10 or 15 pages document, because each word has a meaning behind it, and therefore it needs to be negotiated by the about 190 members or countries in the world that are represented, plus the observers. So it's very you either love it or hate it, because you either have patience for this discussion or not. With this said, when you make global policy, as much as possible, we always try to gather all the scenarios, meaning what you are just asking, the big producers and the small producers. That's what we do when we do policy. We work on guidelines, for example, that they can apply to every sector. And as much as possible, we try to do it. I guess most of the times at this level, at this global health policy level, sometimes it's more targeting the big producers, like poultry production in general, pig producers in general, etc. But there's also guidelines for small producers. And for example, we hosted a webinar a few weeks ago on organic or biological producers and how they could address also AMR and so on and so on and so on. So I think your point is valid. When I look back, I think most of our documents, many of them, are targeting larger scale production. For example, because if you think like the webinar, and a lot of our work is on antimicrobial resistance and the use of antibiotics in the industrial production compared with the backyard production that has 1 or 2 cows, for example, there's no comparison. And again, I think from the large production sectors, there has been really, and we are pleased to see that it's not, of course, yet at all the perfect scenario, but the big producers are trying as much as possible to adjust their habits to make a reduction on use. So again, we need to be careful with these extreme biased views. And so I wouldn't say like only that. Sometimes, and again, it's time to be neutral. Please don't take the message that only the big producers use a lot of antibiotics, because sometimes it's not true. And actually, as consumers demand it, for example, sometimes you see the no antibiotics ever. Probably you have heard NAE, no antibiotics ever. And this means producers that never use antibiotics, which is quite extreme as well. And it raises several different concerns about this. So a lot of the attention is on big producers, and a lot of the message is they use a lot of antibiotics, which is not always the case. The small producers in general, they do tend to use much less use of antibiotics. And again, like what you said, most of our policies, I would say, are thinking about where do you use more antibiotics. And this tends to be in the more industrialized food production, with some exceptions that are looking at small producers, backyard producers, for example, that tend to use in general smaller amounts of antibiotics.
I think B2 has responded better. Thank you so much. We can now go to Abdul Ghaffar. What do you?
Yeah. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Daniel, for the opportunity. Doctor, thank you for wonderful presentation. Very educative and very interesting. Thank you so much. For confirmation, please can you hear me well?
Not very well, but we can hear you good enough.
Okay. So thank you once again, Doctor. My first question is, it is kind of unclear to me how AMR casually influences obesity development in humans. Please, can you try to shed more light on that? And
I didn't hear. It's maybe you can repeat. It's not. It's not clear to you. I understood something about development in humans, or.
Yeah, I'll come again. I said it is unclear to me how AMR casually influences obesity. That is obesity development in human beings.
I could maybe it's easy if you type perhaps in the chat, because I missed the critical part of your question. I understand it's unclear something about AMR in humans, and then I missed the middle part.
I'll try to, okay. Can you hear me now?
A bit better. Let's see this time.
Okay. Like, is there how is it? How in what way does AMR influence obesity development in human beings? Did you get that?
Influences human development.
Like how does AMR?
Yes, maybe a colleague understood it and can say it. Yes.
Yeah, I think he was saying he's asking how AMR influences obesity. I think that's
Obesity.
yes.
No, no,
Yes,
no.
yes.
No. Oh,
Okay.
sorry. No. It's a good to clarify it. No. It's to my knowledge. Well, there's some things that I've read about obesity, and or for example, even on cancer development and so on. But no, the message there is not that. And thank you for asking that, just to make sure that we clarified. No, my connection with obesity is these are two global health problems. Antimicrobial resistance and childhood obesity or obesity in general. And the connection that I made is that on obesity, sometimes people, it gets into your mind this apocalyptic or extremely negative view, in the sense that if an individual is obese, this person sometimes gets really convinced that I will never recover, I will never be healthy, I will never lose weight. See, and therefore, well, I will keep eating chocolates or eating fries or whatever it meant the obesity, and they don't change habits because of this. They get convinced that the results will always be the same and will always be bad. And what I said on AMR is this: as you can see, and there's a lot of results out there. There is, like, if you look for AMR, I just showed you, sometimes you find it in river. As I said, you even find it in spatial stations. You tend to find that when you look for AMR, you find it in wild animals, and etc., etc., etc. And this is important to understand. Okay, this is a One Health issue. The links are connected. How the transmission routes are important to understand. For example, there's the Danish colleagues look for the sewage from airplanes, flights, and of course you'll find AMR bacteria there. So basically, you find it everywhere. So from a technical point of view, this is important. But the message is we cannot only have this apocalyptic message that AMR is everywhere and we are all going to die of AMR. And there's millions of people already dying of AMR, because then there's the risk that clinicians, for example, will say, well, it's already so bad. Why should I change my habits? Then I'll keep using the drugs that I know that more or less work, that I might even know that I should not be using them because it's important to keep them for extreme cases. But if everybody keeps telling me that the situation is so bad, then I'll keep doing the same thing. And so the key concept is the results are not great. The current situation is not ideal, but it is possible to improve it if we do, each one of us does a little piece of our responsibility. And for example, the last global report on antimicrobial use report a decrease on the amount of antibiotics or antimicrobials used, and this is good news. Now, it will take time to see the translation of this decrease in use to decrease in resistance, but it's a good starting point, and therefore we should not lose the hope that these changes in behavior does mean a better outcome for all of us in the future.
Okay, thank you for that, doctor. The second question is this might sound funny, so just answer the kid. He said something about cow milk, and that if we should be using it for other usage, like fueling, something like that. I think you said that. So my question here, without wasting my time, without wasting much of time, is that we happen to have maize meal milk in our body. You know, it's rich in calcium, vitamins, and so and cow milk precisely is even more rich than any other. So now how is it going to how can we treat those the milk? How can we treat them to make them perfect for us to use, since we seems to have a kind of a need for it? So is there a way we can treat those milk so as to make them perfect for us without causing further harm to our body, or introducing some kind of dangerous bugs into our body? That's my second question. Do you get it?
Well, thank you very much. I could not hear it. Yeah, only bits and pieces. Maybe another colleague heard it and could say it loud.
Okay, hello. He was asking now, because we don't have an, as right now, a direct solution to how we then dispose the milk during the withdrawal period, the one that has residues.
Yeah.
Is there an alternative, or what would your opinion be in terms of coming up with an intervention where that milk can be treated and then maybe good?
Well, well, it's a good point. It's a problematic point. Like I tell you the short answer is, unfortunately, especially in low resource settings, at the moment there's no good answer or good solution. That's the short and not so positive answer. Like the answer, the best that I've seen is using it as biogas, but this comes with, you need all this sophisticated equipment to transform from that milk with residues to produce biogas. But this is not the easiest thing to do in low resource settings. If you don't feed it to the animals, then it's really, you ended up dumping it into the environment, into the sewage. And somehow this is when we say about One Health, sometimes it initially can be a bit scary, but hopefully you overcome this scary point and then it becomes interesting in this sense. Okay, you don't give it to the animals, you put it in the environment, but guess what? We all live in the certain environment. So sooner or later you will get exposed to those that can get exposed to this microorganisms, residues, etc. So the message is, okay, if you don't you do it in environment, which is not much better. What is the long-term action that needs to be taken? Again, reduce the need. So you say that usually most common in adult cows, use them to treat mastitis. So the solution is you need to make all the hygiene and in the milking parlor, etc., the measures that will allow you not, or make you not need antibiotics, and then therefore it's a chain. So if you don't use antibiotics, you don't get the milk with residues. If you don't get the milk with residues, then you don't need to worry about what to do with that milk. So that's the long-term actions that need to be taken to prevent that situation, that at the moment there's no easy solution. Either giving it to animals or dumping it to the environment sooner or later can reach humans and detrimental effects in the environment, which is really not very good.
Okay, I think you had another question, I think, which maybe we can just address briefly, because the system is not knowing that we may be able to hear the other side. It was on how does hand sanitizer increase the resistance of AMR? Yeah, so maybe you can expand on
we need to be just making we need to be careful on not making that direct association. The message is, if you think about antimicrobial, like you think about even the product that you use, like let's use lay terms. When you go to the supermarket and you buy these disinfectants for the floor or whatever you buy to clean something, sometimes they even say it kills 99% of the pathogens, 99% of the bacteria, 99% of the microorganisms. And there's a reason why they say it. It's because they are antimicrobial products, right? When you use that gel, it is like, why did they use it? Because they wanted to kill a virus that potentially could be in our hands, and therefore we wanted and we want to break the cycle of transmission by killing the virus that could be in our hands. So when you stop and think about it, it is still an antimicrobial. It's a gel that we put that was initially envisioned to be used in, for example, if a surgeon was in a war scenario and had to do a surgery in the war field, and he had to, well, not disinfect, but clean the hands as much as possible, then that was one of the initial goals of having these gels was that. So now we had to do it in a massive way because we were facing a massive pandemic, global pandemic. So again, I think it was a needed thing to do to break the cycle of transmission. We just need to be aware that it is still an antimicrobial that we are exposing in our hands to break the cycle. What this will mean in the future in terms of AMR, I don't think we have an answer yet. And again, we always need to be careful not to create too much panic. That's never a good thing. again, it's needed. For example, what should you do then? Ideally, it's if possible, if you have access to clean water and soap, it's better. If it's just a matter of prevention, if it's just a matter of making sure that you have your hands clean, it is better to use running clean water and soap. But as we both all know, many times these things don't exist. And in that case, yes, and if you are still facing situations where the prevalence of COVID is very high, then the use of a gel to clean your hands is a needed thing that we are aware that might mean a cost in the future. So if possible, try to avoid it and use water and soap.
Thank you. Thanks so much for that response, Dr. Jorge. I can see we have one hand up. I think maybe you have addressed the others as you're answering the questions, and that is from Iradat. Maybe Iradat, we can have your question as the last one. Over to you.
Okay. Good evening, everybody. Am I audible? Danny, am I audible?
Yes, we can hear you too. There are some moments of break, but you can just go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you to the speakers. It was really wonderful to listen to you today. My question is concerning the awareness you talked about. You said a lot of awareness has been made concerning the misuse of antimicrobials drug. So my question is, in order for us to take action, like you said, is action that needs to be taken in order to actually curb this issue. So how do you think that the surveillance system in developing countries, especially Africa, can be strengthened in order to make sure that farmers or food industries are actually complying with the use of microbials to make sure that they're not misusing it and that they're using it in the adequate manner? And how can codex alimentarians be implemented in this country?
Yeah. No, thank you. That's a top question, and it's important to understand the frames, fully understand the frame. So let's see. Surveillance, like your question is very relevant about surveillance. Surveillance is essential to have this evidence-based policy. In this sense, if you cannot measure it, you cannot improve it. And so surveillance of both parts, and a lot of the attention until now has been given to measuring use. And we now have a lot of initiatives here at FAO on not only measuring use, but measuring also resistance, and then to later make the connection between both of them. So surveillance is important because of that, because we need to, as much as possible, run away from this idea, I think this is good, I think this is bad, I think the poultry production is top, I think the aquaculture is not top, etc. So surveillance does give us the data to saying this is good or not good, or we need to improve or not improve, etc., etc., etc. So this is why surveillance is so important, to have data and to then do evidence-based policy. So Codex made these guidelines, which is a principle, guidelines of integrated surveillance. So the guidelines are is not a cooking book. And again, because doing global policy is fascinating, but you cannot, like you said, I think you mentioned how to do this in a low resource setting African country. You cannot expect the country that is in that situation to take the same measures than extremely a top 5 G5, G7 country, one of the wealthiest economies in the world. So this is not realistic. But again, at the global policy, you do guidelines for the world. And they, as much as possible, there needs to be room for each of the extreme realities to adopt them. So a starting point is to have them. And we do have these Codex standards that have been adopted by, in general, all the countries in the world, 190 countries in the world, which is a very, very significant number. So what have we done now? And again, it was not in African countries, but both in Asia and South America have been countries that low resource settings countries. And one of the major things is we have been organizing meetings with about 40 key stakeholders in each country. And usually they come from the Minister of Health, Agriculture, and Environment. And it's very good to have them there, because you are right. Many countries struggle with economic resources, and how do they implement this? in their countries. At the same time, often is the importance of awareness, making sure that policymakers are aware of the importance of this topic. In this sense, it's not just about treating sick humans. It's also about that. It's also about human lives, but it also impacts animal health, environmental health, plant health. And one of the major things is food security. We do need antimicrobials at the moment to make sure that we have food to make it available for the different populations. So what we see in this meeting is that some countries do struggle and they don't have the resources. Often they can start allocating some resources to do, for example, surveillance when we raise the awareness for this and they understand, okay, this is important, not just for this perspective that it tends to be narrow. Okay, it's the narrow perspective of health. But if we go to a country and they have the chance to discuss between ministers and raise awareness to it, they can allocate some resources. And often it's a matter of making better use of resources. And sometimes what we see in these countries, we go to a country and each of the 3 ministers or 4 most commonly involved in this are doing things, but not in a coordinated way. And if they start doing it in a more coordinated way, they can allocate some resources to do, for example, surveillance. And usually they have to start from a more basic level, but then envisioning an integrated surveillance. So this is the long answer to your question. I think we have the tools. Again, we have the guidelines, not perfect guidelines, but it is there. And often we go to the meetings to the countries and we raise awareness. And we are pleased to see that once we put these 2 things together with the proper guidance, many of the countries are transitioning, okay, I can start doing surveillance. And the surveillance can be done at different levels. For example, to the World Organization for Animal Health, a country can start reporting the antimicrobials that they use simply by saying, these are the classes of antibiotics that they use. It's a starting point. Again, you cannot expect a country starting their surveillance system to start doing the surveillance of the classes of antibiotics used at the field level. That's the most advanced, that's the most granular data that we have at this point. But it can be stepwise. So you start from even a qualitative point of view, and then you go down the road to make it ultimately the granular integrated surveillance. So it's a stepwise approach, progress approach. Thank you for the question. Great question.
Okay, thank you so much, sir, for the explanation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jorge, for that really informative session. I've really learned a lot on my end, and I'm sure that we've all learned so much. So at this juncture, I don't really want to eat more of your evening. I'll just request maybe you can share some final remarks and we can close off. Thanks so much.
No, thank you very much for the invitation. It's pleasant to see that young people, in this case in Africa, but in different continents, are interested in the topic, because I think the older we are, the harder it is to change behavior. So it's good to see that you are interested in the topic. And I think then as the next steps, try to digest all of this information, think that you are consumers. And for example, one of the things that I always suggest that colleagues do is, for example, many of you might have, some of you might have already children, might have kids, or you might have brothers, sisters, siblings, other siblings, more siblings, nieces, nephews, or just kids or friends. And one of the things that is very interesting and very pleasant is to go to their schools, elementary schools, for example, high schools, middle schools, and speak with them about these things. Of course, you have to adjust to the audience that will be speaking, but it is important to start speaking with the different stakeholders, in this case, for example, children, of the importance of the topic and the importance of being aware of this, that antibiotics are good. And again, you cannot speak about co-resistance mechanisms to children, but you can reach out to different audiences and then spreading the awareness on this topic. So that's your challenge, that's your homework, if you want, after the class. And keep in touch. It's always pleasant to hear from young colleagues like all of you interested on this topic. And thank you for the invitation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jorge, for that really wonderful presentation. We are really glad to have him also here, what you told us. Yeah, And as we've been given an assignment, I know we are nearing World Antimicrobial Awareness Week. So let's try and reach out to the young ones, the ones in high schools and primary and elementary, and also educate them on this. Thank you so much. We really
Thank
do
you.
appreciate it.
Have a
And
nice
we
evening.
keep in touch. Bye bye and have a nice
Bye-bye.
evening.
Thank you very much.